Family, today we are talking about the Black and Brown relationships and the history of Black and Brown relationships. Stay tuned. This is going to be a good conversation with our guest today. This is Freedom Friday, and you're still not free. Welcome, friends and family. It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after an hour with my guests and me. And today I say my guest because Sharif El Mekki, my normal co-host and homie, is not with us. He is traveling the world doing great things, attempting to make sure that we get enough Black teachers in the classroom, specifically Black male teachers. Nationally, as you all will know, if you have watched the show for a long time, there is less than 2% Black male teachers in the classroom. And Sharif's life work is to travel the country, visit districts, generate kind of pipelines, and work with programs in districts and colleges to make sure that we increase that number. People that don't teach themselves can't reach themselves. Ooh, look at that. See, I'm doing some Jesse Jackson early in the morning. Look at me. Look at me. Anyways, today we are going to talk about Black and Brown history, relations, solidarity, unity, all the things that mature Black and Brown people, such as ourselves, people with gray in our beards, some of us more gray in our beards than others, should be teaching our younger generations about. I do want to say, every time we talk in Freedom Friday, at Freedom Friday, my main concern is how are we teaching the young generation? So that's a question that hangs over my head. What should we, as people with a little bit of gray in our beards, be teaching our youngsters about this topic? And today's topic is Black and Brown bridges. My co-host today are more than qualified to answer that question without me. So I might just actually back out of the show and just leave it on them and leave out, go do something else and just listen to the show. Today we have David Castillo from California, from San Diego, just a person that if you don't know him, you should follow him on Twitter, find him on Twitter and follow him because you will get a steady stream of good content, of good takes, not bad takes, not hot takes, good takes, specifically on education. I hate to use the word equity, but justice, justice and education, and probably a dose of democracy in there too, with a little bit of cynicism and reality, earned cynicism and reality about the system. We also have Omar Yanar, who is in Houston, no, in Texas. I don't know if it's Houston, sir.
El Paso, Texas.
El Paso, Texas.
Indeed.
Paso, Texas.
El Paso, Texas.
Yeah, right. So you said earlier today when we were talking before this that things trigger for you a memory when you hear a thing. This is not going to be great, but the El Paso, that triggers for me the 80s commercials on salsa when it's from New York City. New York
City. El Paso salsa. Not even made in El Paso, interesting.
Not even made in what? Really?
Yeah, it's funny.
See, we have been lied to and deceived as consumers, people. Listen, when you hear this topic about Black and Brown relationships, history, solidarity, and you think about the next generation, what is most important to you that you think that we attend to intellectually to pass on to them a tradition of Black and Brown solidarity?
I'll let Omar go first. He's working in the school building now. So yeah. You want me to go?
All right. Go ahead.
You go.
I was
okay.
You're the dude of knowledge, man.
Yeah. Well, okay. That's a big question. Thank you for having us on, Chris. Appreciate the invitation. And so I think before I jump into the importance of identifying connections between the African American, Black, and Latino communities, I think in terms of school, there's this piece I think that we're talking about now, but we're talking about in the wrong way. And so the way that it matters of education and curriculum are currently being framed under this like critical race theory issue that we see right now, that's become like an electoral issue. What I have to say is directly related to that. And so What I feel like at a minimum schools should be doing, and I'm not talking about the conversations that happen in the home. That's a whole other thing which we should get into, because they're, people that could be considered the formal education for many communities. I'm just talking about education in like public or private schools. We've lost our way over the last maybe 5 or 10 years away from talking about things like science and social science and history and civics, right? We've become so oriented towards math and language arts. That's all that we hear about. There's a whole bunch of reasons behind that. In terms of curriculum in schools and better understanding, the issues around solidarity and connectedness and tension and conflict, which I think we should all teach all facets of, is schools should be providing, we say accurate account of history in a particular way. There's a particular way to teach history through the examination of events, through the examination of historical artifacts. And then you allow children to make meaning of what they are seeing, make meaning of events, make meanings of things that have happened historically from their perspective. I think there's a whole, like, we're talking about the science of reading right now and how do you teach reading, but there's a science behind effective teaching of history. And then the second thing is, which we're talking about now, and I feel like the framework is turned on its head, is making sure that schools that are in particular areas, and even not, provide opportunities for young people to then look at history through the perspective of their own people, right? So we might have a broad thing that says United States history, right? And we teach it one way. Generally, we teach it through that, it starts when the Mayflower landed in like wherever, Plymouth Rock, right? But in reality, we all came here. Some of us were here, some of us came voluntarily, some of us are forced to come here. Looking at history through the particular perspective of the African American experience. That's a very different history book, a very, very different stories, very different perspective. Looking at history through the lens of the Asian American experience. That's a very different, history, starting with the Chinese in the West. Looking at United States history, and I say United States because people say American in America, we are one part of the Americas, the United States of America. Looking at U.S. history from the perspective of the Mexican American story, and that too is very different. And so I think making sure that our schools, and very few schools are doing this now, but this is really kind of the curriculum that you start to get when you move into the community college and college system. We should be doing this, early on in ethnic studies. We should be pushing it down to middle school, really opening up history so that students can see the good, the bad, and the ugly, and start to make those connections for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned in there that there is a science to teaching history, which means it's not like a fuzzy field of just storytelling. There is a discipline in teaching it. You also mentioned that the focus that we have on math and reading. Like a lot of the math and reading, I think, is just a no-brainer for a lot of people because they are considered like hard subjects that are foundational to everything else that you do. So everybody can agree on that. Excuse me. But when you think about something like ethnic studies, like not just history, but ethnic studies, you feel like the science is as strong about the need for ethnic studies as a pathway to achievement, like academic achievement. Is the science around that as strong?
I mean, I would say, I don't know if the science behind it is strong. I would say that the earlier that, you can put a curriculum or you can put lectures in front of young people where they actually see themselves, right? Might not be the most articulate or well-crafted lessons or activities or units, but the sooner that students can actually see themselves in K-12 curriculum and grab onto that and get curious, the better. And I think there is science behind, making sure that, students see themselves in the curriculum, because then that draws young people into the curriculum and into learning, as opposed to, having their story told by somebody else when they're like a, second or third person voice.
And Omar, when you think about this in the school context, I mean, there's a lot to be taught that has to be taught through the day. It's like, every subject is competing for time. How do you prioritize, or do you have to prioritize it? Do you just kind of embed things like ethnic studies and, like how do you fit it in?
Man, that was a great setup. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us on the show. Honored to be here. You can do both. So there's not a but, but an and also. And one of the ways that could be done very simply is I think about this time when I went to grad school and to college. And let me just kind of go into this story really quick because it will make some sense. I had the privilege of going to the Stanford University as an undergrad, and then I was at Harvard Kennedy School and got to take a lot of classes at the Harvard School of Education. And the debates that we had at the Harvard Graduate School of Education when I got to go to class over there was really about this debate over should kids have this shared literacy, and should all these kids be reading the exact same books so that by the time they got to college, they would have this shared understanding and could have these discussions? Or was it more about the skill set of literacy? And where I'm going with this is rewind back to 1998. I'm at Stanford, and it's a cultural blow in the face for a kid from El Paso. This is a town that's majority Latino, Latina. It's 85%. And while I've had the honor and privilege of kind of being in different ethnic circumstances throughout my life to prepare me, it is a cultural shock to get to a place like Stanford. When you're there, everyone is read all the same things. So people are talking about your Great Gatsbys and your Catchers of the Rye, and I'm sure our audience is really familiar with that. But like, it was badass, Chris, to have walked in being like, have you ever read Gabriel Garcia Marquez? Any of y'all read Bless Me Ultima? Any of y'all read the autobiography of Malcolm X? And these were books that I was exposed to as a result of my sister, who went to Stanford before me, right? And what I realized was that from an education perspective, I had the literacy skills. However, what I did have was a massive differentiation in my understanding of Black and Brown communities, not just simply because of the books, but the books gave me a certain level of empathy and understanding about a reality that I knew very little about and made me want to explore further. And I think when I talk about the education world, going back to Harvard and that debate about should kids have that shared literacy in terms of the books they read or a shared skill set, I'm 1,000% towards the skill set. I want our kids reading books that are going to help them understand that there are Latino and Latina protagonists, books where there is Black and Brown unity, books where they understand the history of Black America. Because I've got to tell you, Chris, it is fascinating to see that in 2022, those things are just kind of getting swept underneath the rug. And coming from Texas in particularly, where they are purposely in the history books sweeping that under the rug. I mean, Chris, the people in Texas at the State Board of Education, it was a big reason I wanted to run, were trying to sweep slavery underneath the rug and say that it was involuntary servitude. That was the literal term. Yeah. So when David talks about the historical component, I'm absolutely for that. And I could go large scale into teaching Howard Zinn in our classrooms and having that varied perspective. But I think what I stress at the El Paso Leadership Academy, which is the group of charter schools that I founded here in El Paso that I'm still running to this day, is two things. Well, actually a lot of things, but one of them is you can have the best of both worlds and teach literacy and teach comprehension and teach reading skills. Choose some really great material that these kids are going to be incredibly excited about and expose them to realities that they may not be exposed to. In a town like El Paso, Chris, we're 85% Latino, the Black population is minute. It makes me incredibly sad. Like, I lived in San Francisco, I was in Oakland, I'm like, yo, where are my people at?
Mhm.
And I mean, like, they're like, there's like 5 of them. And, you know, when I find them, I'm like, man, how you doing, brother? It's great to see you. They're like, yo, man, who the hell are you? Back up off of me. I'm just so grateful to see it. But this is what I'm getting at. If children aren't exposed to the population as a matter of, you know, as a matter of diversity within their school or diversity within their neighborhood, then there's got to be a utensil in our school to help us have these discussions and having a better understanding of not just the Black history of the United States, Chris, but ultimately these kids don't realize that the brown history of the United States was in many ways like not so great. There were signs in El Paso that were like, no Irish, no Mexican, no dogs.
Yeah.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
And I think that's what gets into the factor of combining the history and the literacy to help kids have a greater understanding. Because I got to tell you, by the time it gets to adults, unfortunately, it gets metastasized and it gets solidified, and it's very difficult to try to upend some of these bad lessons that they were taught.
Yep. And I want to add one quick thing before we move on. I've seen, you know, I don't think it's an either or. I do think it can be a both in terms of high quality instruction in any subject, and then also utilizing content that is relevant to the backgrounds of the students that are in those schools. And you know, it's all relevant. But when I say this, I think, you know, this benefits Asian children too, and white children also, right? We can like learn across different backgrounds. What I've seen, and I think what we've seen are, you know, schools that perhaps have a good high quality, you know, they use high quality teaching methods, but the actual content is void of any melanin, right? On the other side, I've seen, you know, activist revolutionary schools that are perhaps good at content, but absent of any high quality teaching methods, right? So we're talking about is like, you can actually merge the two. It's not just like, you know, we get stuck in these binaries of this or that. And when, you know, you can do high quality teaching in the art classroom using, you know, the Ramar Bearden, you know, style of collage making, right? You can do high quality literary analysis of James Baldwin or of Sandra Cisneros. You know, you can, so it's really going back to your point, Chris, about the time squeeze. Now we're kind of getting into what good schools, good school networks do around professional development, professional learning, and planning, so teachers can actually work across different disciplines to do multidisciplinary planning and activities for children. So you're not doing one thing at one time. You might be doing 3 things at one time in the classroom, right?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting too, because, you know, teaching, learning, the whole thing of schooling is a series of choices. It's a lot of choices that you have to make. What am I going to teach? How am I going to teach it? What am I going to draw from? What's going to be my source material? You know, how long am I going to do it? How am I going to engage the kids? These are all decisions. So, and they're choices that you make, and you have to ask yourself, well, who's the choice maker, right? Like, so if I'm a choice maker with a limited pool of range, like a limited range of things like literature, art, you know, history, informants, what I will call informants, like you're introducing kids to informants, people who are informing them of the world in which they live in. Then if I'm limited in that way, then my kid's going to be limited. My classroom's going to be limited. So when I hear things like what you said, Omar, about, you know, I think you were touching on the canon, like there's shared knowledge that we're supposed to have. There's like these common books we're supposed to read, Catch and Write, you know, Shakespeare, all that type of stuff to me is boring as hell. Always hated it, you know, never had a good experience with it. Sharif will tell you this comes up on our show oftentimes when we're talking back and forth. I mean, I think Sharif is like a Renaissance man in that, you know, he loved some Muslim things, and he loved a little Shakespeare, and he loved a little this, man. All of that stuff to me was the mainstream stuff was so culturally irrelevant. And I saw the joy in my white teachers that they had in it, and I almost resented their joy in it because it was for them. And it was written for them. Of course you enjoy that. And of course you're making me try to enjoy it in the same way that you tried to make me enjoy smallpox blankets, right? Where everybody every hero is white, and everything about love is white, and everything is thou shalt art, blah, 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 blah. It sounds stupid to me, right? Put something before me that adds something to my life, and I'm more interested now, right? Like now I, you know, but I say all that, that's a little bit of a rant, but I'll say all that just to say, when we do get to cultural material for Black and Brown authors, we do talk a lot about history, and we talk a lot about ethnic studies. But is there a philosophy? Is there a Chicano philosophy on life? Is there an African American philosophy on labor? Is there, you know, like, is it more than history, like more than the past? Are we missing out on teaching kids something even more intellectual about these sources that we're drawing from than just history or just what we did before, but philosophy on life, you know, worldview? What's the Mexican outlook on food versus the, you know, the Native American outlook on dance and music and song or whatever, you know? Are we missing out on more?
That's a great question. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. I don't know if there's an actual I don't know the answer to your question, but what I can say is that you know, and saying like, and going even deeper, like saying that, you know, is there a Mexican perspective on something is actually quite different than saying, is there like a Mexican American Chicano perspective on something, right? And I think it goes back to my earlier point around the importance of, now here's where the home education, the home culture, home language comes in, you know, home experience, learning from our elders. You know, one of the most important things that happened to me growing up was, you know, when I was actually able to merge the background knowledge that I had acquired from my parents, from my grandparents, from their stories of growing up as farm workers, and all of the history associated with that came with music and food and art, and then merging that with the education. You know, like I said, when I was first able to like see myself in a textbook, didn't happen until my first or second year of college, right? It should have happened a lot earlier. But that's when I was able to merge those two for me, and I feel like for so many young people, and I think I'm getting to your point, Chris, is that the perspective, there is a unique perspective. We're talking about historical events, but once we have a good and a solid grasp, a sound grasp on our history, then we know what our place is in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's when your worldview really starts to change, because once you know your place in the world, once I really understood my place in the world, living in the Southwest, which we call Aztlán, as a Chicano, as a Mexicano Americano, then I was able to, you know, sit on my ground, stand on my ground, and then better hear and understand the stories and perspective of others, because I knew where I was coming from, and I knew where my place was in the world. So it does move from sort of a historic, we're talking about history, knowing your history, but then that puts you in a good, you know, on solid ground so that you can see the world. And then it moves into the different realms of like spirituality and all this other stuff, which we're not going to talk about now. But yeah, I do feel like there's a continuum there.
Man, that's a great question. I've got two quick stories about that. The first one is, all right, let's take this back to the old school. I am in 7th grade, and my mom she's an exceptional woman. As a teacher herself, grew up in the barrio in El Paso. And it was fascinating because, you know, when I started getting a little bit older, we started having very interesting conversations. At 7th grade, and in Texas, Chris, it would surprise you maybe to know that we get 2 years of full-blown Texas history. Just a full year in fourth grade and in seventh grade. Now, here's the problem, and this is where history really comes to this factor. In seventh grade, as we're talking about Texas history, we love Texas to spend, I mean, I'm not lying, Chris, like a month talking about the Alamo. And like, that's not an exaggeration. It's like we're spending a month on the Texas Revolution, 2 weeks on the Alamo. That was one battle. But here's where history and this ingrained almost, it's essentially propaganda, is getting highly pervasive in a student's educational background. To be the brown kid in the room in the subject of the Alamo, which, if taught correctly, the Alamo and the Texas Revolution was one in which a group of traitors, the Texans, the Texians, and I'm going to get like strung up and lynched for this perspective being from Texas. These traitors basically like showed up to Mexico 2, 3, 4 weeks before the revolution or the Alamo started, with the very focused intent of ensuring that Texas got separated from Mexico and brought into the United States. And it was a plan that was hatched by President Andrew Jackson and Sam Houston at the time, thus the city of Houston. That's history, right? How do I know this? I'm sitting in the classroom, and what's being taught to me in the classroom is that us dirty little Mexicans, straight up, these are the words that were being used by students who are being reflective of their parents' ideologies, were suppressing and subjugating these white freedom fighters. And these white freedom fighters got up and stood up for their liberty and fought and destroyed these Mexican dictators and Mexican, subjugators, and they won their freedom and they won their day. And I'm like, holy crap. So you get a group of seventh grade kids really revved up about this. And what happens is that I saw it work out in real life. The white kids are like looking at me like I'm the enemy. And the brown kids are cowering because now we're painted as the enemy. And now we feel highly subjugated because it's like, oh my God, like, look at what we did. And the story goes into the fact that my mom sat me down with a Mexican encyclopedia, and she's like, let me tell you what's up with the real Alamo story. The real Alamo story is exactly what I just said. These Texans showed up 2 weeks before. They had the intent of rebellion and essentially being a traitor, because in order to come into Texas, you had to become a Mexican citizen, right? All that's really it. Like, Mexico asked, hey man, like, become a Catholic, and everyone's like, yeah, whatever, cool, we're Christian, so like we'll just pretend we're Catholic, be a Mexican citizen, and like pay taxes. That's it. And those are like the 3 rules. So like, what subjugation was going on? But in reality, they were there to take that land. You know it, I know it, but the history books didn't teach it. So my main point about this story was that because I had a different perspective, I was able to critically think through what was being taught in the classroom. So when we think about what's being taught in the classroom, and it can be done in English and in history and in art, we have got to start teaching critical thinking. But the thing is, Chris, is that everyone talks about teaching critical thinking, but people don't know what critical thinking is, least of all the mechanisms to embed it into pedagogy in order to teach it. And that is huge, because once you start teaching critical thought, Chris, you start really analyzing the history, the literacy, the news that you're listening to. Like, we couldn't need this more in America, because ultimately, if kids are unable to critically think through things, then what happens is that they're just getting fed this like spoonful of propaganda. Now, add to this recipe empathy, because yes, Chris, it can be taught in a classroom. Empathy can be taught. It can be embedded into the pedagogy. We do it all the time. And, I'll get off on another story later about that. But to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes and understand their circumstances as best as possible is something that, even our chat said it is great for every kid. Yeah, this is great for white kids to be able to empathize with the black and brown scenario and to quickly address
I don't know if that's true though.
Huh?
I don't know if
you don't
that's
know
true.
what's true. That white kids should have empathy?
Well, should is different than that it's good for them. I think what's good for them is to be ignorant to everything else besides themselves. I think that's the best you can have it in America, is to be ignorant about everybody else and to stick with the dominant story. And I think when we talk about like thinking critically, I think we're teaching kids to think critically about non-dominant stories. And I think we're teaching them to think uncritically about the dominant stories that keep the system as it is and to keep things. So we are supposed to think uncritically, and we're supposed to teach our kids to think uncritically about the so-called founding fathers. Whose fathers are these? You know, who's your daddy? Who's your daddy? These ain't my fathers. Wait, what is this nonsense, right? Like my daddy didn't teach me that at home. What am I doing here? Right?
That's
the founding
so funny,
fathers, the the Constitution's the best document that ever. That wasn't supposed to be permanent. That was supposed to be for a period of time, and that was supposed to change. Thomas Jefferson
from that apartment in the sky.
Thomas Jefferson said himself that the living should not be governed by the dead, right? So people say today, oh, you want reparations. There's not a single person alive today who was ever a slave. And there was not a single person alive today who was a slave owner. Now, first of all, that's inaccurate. Like slavery continues today and blah, blah. If you ever want to have a serious discussion, people who are saying that, if you want to have a serious one, you're going to need to read a little bit. Slavery continues today, as there's 50 million people in slavery today in the world. But there's nobody alive who did any of those things. Well, damn it, there's nobody alive who actually had any input on that Constitution you revere so much. You can't inherit one thing and not inherit the rest of the stuff, right? You can't say I'm deeply not connected to the past and slavery, any of that, except for the systems, the structures, the Constitution, the rules, the stories, the dominant kind of narratives and myths and everything that we've been taught. And you're not supposed to be critical about those. But anytime you introduce ethnic studies, well, how, what's the historicity of this thing that you're trying to teach now? And, well, you made an error here. There's a thing or two here that doesn't see what I'm saying? It's like, it's a trick. It's a game for us. I don't think that's disagreeing with what you said. I'm only making a point, like just to like turn the knife on the fact that we are not, and Texas is a big offender in creating the dominant stories for the rest of the country, like because of their textbook miseducators. And California too has a hand in that too, as being the biggest textbook markets. They have a hand in putting out the Alamo the way that they want the Alamo taught, and the way that your mom wanted the Alamo taught is almost like folk wisdom. It's folk schooling. I mean, damn, we might as well put all our kids in folk school. We might as well create a nation of folk schools and get them out of these like colonist schools and teach them the real critical thinking that they're missing in the classrooms. Now, I do want to shift gears a little bit because this show's about, black and brown. And I'm shaking my head at everything you say about the miseducation of the Latino child, the Chicano child, the Mexican child, the child that is otherized for having Latin roots in classrooms. And I can shake my head with that and go, that is so close to me and resonant to me, because that's exactly the same situation that's happening with Black children and has for so long. So it's almost as if we should have this natural affinity with each other, like black and brown. We say it black and brown, B and B, black and brown, black and brown, black and brown, black and brown, right? So it's almost because we have a natural affinity with a shared experience with the colonist, right? And I'm just want to ask, as a point of realism, does that natural affinity hold up anymore the way that it used to? I grew up in it, seeing the world that way because my dad did. My father did, my family did, whatnot. But now it feels a little old-fashioned. Our proximity to each other has changed. Our city layouts have changed. Our intercultural relationships haven't changed completely, but I'd say in a place like Texas, Black folks have dissipated in lots of places, and Latino populations have grown. Places like Stockton, California, for instance, though, when I visit there's a lot of intercultural, like, you have Black and brown families, like literally your families are, your culture, your cars look the same, your music sounds the same, you're sharing. So how much of that is the real of where we still are today? This natural affinity for each other and solidarity that we should have?
I mean, I'll say I think it was probably easier in the 1960s and 1970s. A story that I recently uncovered, a family story, was I never knew that one of my mother's sisters was a brown beret, and she spent time in California. And I think through watching our podcast, the South Star Classroom plug, you know, she got interested and started watching and sent me a couple of messages, and you know, she told me that she had spent a series of summers organizing with the Brown Berets and the Black Panthers in Los Angeles, like the late '60s or early '70s, and got to know you know, Angela Davis and a whole bunch of other people really well. And I was like, wow, story of solidarity. You know, things were different then, and I think now when we look at you know, looking at what happened and the words that were spoken in this LA Council City debacle, I think what's different now and what's more complex, not impossible, is that, you know, what was a rather homogeneous group of what we call you know, Mexican Americans in the United States has now really changed, and with different patterns of immigration, right? And so we also have you know, Mexican Americans that have lived in the United States for generations now, right? And so now you have this, like, even this within, you know, Mexican American to Mexican American community, you have a divide around class. Add on over the last, you know, 15, 20 years, the influx of immigration from, you know, non-Mexico Latin American countries, you know, mainly Central America. We're seeing that even today, and then some South American countries. Things aren't so clear cut as they used to be, right? Because we as a people, you know, we have not yet identified our shared interests, right? Across background, across country of origin, even across language, right? So I think the answer is, it's complicated, it's more complex, and so I think things are different now. That I think, you know, back in the '60s and '70s, it was probably easier to identify points of solidarity and connection. Today, it's not impossible, but it's just more complex.
Yeah, it almost feels like as both groups, you know, Black folks and Latinos have risen and stratified by class. Like, you know, we have a middle and upper middle class Black contingent now that all used to live together in, you know, the same neighborhoods in earlier times, right? So they have stratified. Like, you know, going to LA, for instance, and looking at what Baldwin Hills is today versus what Baldwin Hills had been at one time is really shocking. And, you know, seeing in LA, Black communities kind of stratified, atomized, kind of in some ways like they've left the city, you know, and have moved further down, you know, out of the city. So proximity, I think, is changing a lot of things. Where there's probably the most solidarity is still in the underclass, the lower working class and the underclass, because they still do have to share, especially in California. I hate to keep picking on y'all for your expensive ass living down there, but like if you can't move anywhere else, of course you're going to have solidarity. You're going to have solidarity because you're going to have equal oppression. You're going to be pushed to the same kind of outskirts of town, and you'll be living on top of each other. So there's a reason for solidarity there and shared culture, you know, joint music and stuff. So Omar, what do you think? Do you think when you think about young people and, you know, being close to schools, do you see the natural affinity playing out? Do you see the solidarity?
No. And I'm worried. So there's a couple of factors here that I'm worried about. And I think David, you know, astutely alluded to the 60s and the civil rights era, because I think in having a common purpose, bridging on the history of both Cesar Chavez, right, and the Black civil rights movement that had a number of leaders and people incorporated into it, right? It was this time of shared purpose that really brings people together. And what's going on now, I see, is echoes of the past and echoes of what I've seen happen in history. So, you know, we were just on 8 Black Hands and we were talking about some of this historical content. And, you know, for those that maybe have listened to that and now listening, I happen to be a history minor. My focus was on colonial and revolutionary America. I know a whole lot about this era.
Of course it was.
Of course it was. Because I want to know, you're talking about the founding fathers. I was like, yo, man, who are you? And what did you talk about? And what you start realizing, Chris, and you know this, and so does David, is that we have this like very interesting historical reverberation. So the Irish came in out of the famine into the United States. And historically, look, the Irish were like 1,000% persecuted and segregated, and like, you can't live with us, you can't be here. There were signs that said no Irish, just like no blacks, no dogs, no Mexicans. And this is how the Irish were treated in the United States, right? So what happened then was, instead of being this constantly segregated class, you know, the white dominant class was like, maybe we should integrate them somehow, because then they'll be on our side. Maybe they could be our police. And if we convince these Irish people that despite the fact that they're extraordinarily low income, despite the fact that they're suffering, despite the fact that they are scraping by, that their situation is better than the blacks, well, then they're just going to be cool, because then they're going to see that, hey, if you guys act right, the dominant culture is saying, if you guys act right, we're going to let you into this class. And hey, don't complain because you're better than the blacks. That was the messaging, right? That is the same messaging I see going on with the Mexican American and the Latino community going on right now in the United States. And listen, guys, whatever your political affiliation is, the Republicans are really leaning into this in a big bad way. And it's like, hey, you guys love family. You guys have conservative values. You guys grew up, you know, mostly Christian. Join our side. Join our side. Like, it's really nice over here. Like, hey, you're going to have it better than the blacks. And they're not saying that explicitly, Chris, but you know that people have an incredible way of embedding these subliminal messages. So sadly, what I'm seeing right now is this reverberation of what happened with the Irish going on with the Latino population, because if they get indoctrinated into the, you know, the Republican Party and the GOP, holy smokes, the amount of Latinos in the United States is growing exponentially. That ensures a pretty solid slate of Republican voters. But with that comes really the sad malaise of, your situation can be like us, the dominant culture. So forget about unity with the blacks. This is really where it's at. And that is deeply echoing in history. And just for our audience, really quickly, if you want to do some reading about the history of this, because I want to get into this, because someone made a comment on our last podcast on 8 Black Hands, and they're like, Omar, you don't know your history. And I'm like, you don't know your history. Back up a minute. You know about Shays Rebellion? Because Shays Rebellion was about low-income farmers who got together a rainbow coalition of people because their circumstances were exactly the same, and saying, we need to fight these banking institutions and these monetary institutions, and this is in colonial times, for some level of equity for our low-income people. And this was like whites and blacks and natives combined. It was amazing. And then guess what happened, Chris? The dominant class came in and they're like, hey, white farmers, why are you working with these people? Come with us. Like, we can make it better, because if you keep fighting us, we're gonna hurt you. But at least your situation's better than the blacks. That worries me, Chris, because that is now again reverberating, and that is something that is reverberating in our kids with the promise, this promise, right, that your situation's going to be better, but you gotta acquiesce to the dominant culture first.
And the dominant culture, going back to one of your earlier points, Chris, is when we think about the dominant culture, Chris is talking about, you know, well, people that are maybe more like low income, that have less ability to choose where or how they live, what schools they go to, maybe we can find more solidarity there. And you do tend to see more of that, but and even across race and background. But even within our own communities, this conversation has me thinking about how even internally we love to divide and conquer. I'm not going to speak for the Black community, but I will speak for the brown community.
Yep.
I'm thinking about the difference of the landscape in like the 1940s in Los Angeles around the time of the Zoot Suit riots, right? A very important historical event that took place there. And then you fast forward to like the 1960s and the 1970s, and then the formation of Latino Mexican American gangs within the California prison system, right? So within, we don't talk in, I mean, we don't talk enough about what happens within prisons, because it's kind of a microcosm of what's happening in society, right? And so, as early as the 60s and 70s, you start to see the formation of the Mexican mafia and other, regional gangs, the Farmeros from Northern California. Well, we're city folks. We're from Los Angeles. It's a city. Y'all are from like Stockton or Fresno. You're like rural Mexicans, the Farmeros, right? And so watch the movie American Me. It tells the whole story. It's not totally 100% accurate, but even within our own communities, this conversation has me thinking about how we're very good at dividing ourselves, for good reason, for reasons of needing to acquire resources and power, and this notion of respect, right? Happens in the Black community too. And so, I think that there's this really important point of like understanding the current dynamics of the Latino community. We're looking at, we still have Latino gangs. The big gangs now are, the Republicans love to push the Malva Salvatrucha, MS-13, right? From El Salvador, right? It's like, man, they're going to come and take your children, right? They're doing it, right? I don't know if they're doing it. They're not good people, but they're, so, but you look at like at one point where, the Latino gangs are mainly like Mexican Americans up against other Mexican Americans. And now, as we've grown as a people and our diaspora is wider, now we have, gangs from Central America that are having an impact here as a result of things that happened here, obviously decades ago. So I just think that you both got my wheels turning around that, and how we don't talk about, gang and like street life enough. Talk about the Bloods and the Crips, right? In Los Angeles, right? There's a whole history there around what was happening in the Black community. So this is, these are the kinds of conversations that we would be having in high school with our kids 20 years ago at Oakland Unity, talking about American history. Well, let's look at it through the perspective of gangs. Talk about getting kids interested, right?
Yeah.
They're going to start listening, right? Yeah.
Well, I think it's getting more and more complicated. All of these factors that you guys just raised are, I think, conversations that should continue, because Omar, I think a lot of what you said to me reminds me of, the new Jim Crow's racial bargain, where, the dominant culture looks for probationary white people to add to their numbers when their numbers aren't surviving well enough. So they did it with the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, keep going down the line, but they did it all with fair-skinned people until they ran out of fair-skinned people. And now they're trying to deputize Asians into whiteness. You guys are so hardworking. You're so amazing. You do so great on test scores. And it has nothing to do with the fact that the majority of your immigration since the Immigration Act passed has been educated people from your countries who come here and look poor, but are actually educated in the countries that they come from. It has nothing to do with that. It just has everything to do with the fact that you're better than the Blacks. You have a better culture. You have more respect for education. You have more respect for teaching and learning. And that's the reason for your success. It's not the $1,500 per student that you pull together for your poor test prep kids. It has nothing to do with any of that. It just has to do, and it doesn't have anything to do with that. Many of you are driving cabs, but you're a doctor in the country that you came from. No, nothing to do with any of that. It's just that you're better than the Blacks. So why don't we deputize you as the new whites? And with the Latinos that can pass the paper bag test, right? Not the ones that have a little brown around their neck because it looks like they've been working an actual job, But, you know, the ones that could kind of, you know, you're white enough, you know, why don't we get you in the fold? It worked with the Cubans. Why don't we, you know, like, why don't we find our next kind of fair skinned Latinos to actually deputize as probationary white people, because our numbers are dwindling, our babies are dwindling. And oh, by the way, you know, we've tried other things first before we got to you. We tried, you know, kind of outlawing or abortion and rolling abortion back to get our numbers up again, and that hasn't worked. We tried to stop people from being gay because, you know, that has an impact on our birth rate, whatnot. But we don't want to, you know, that's not working. So now we're going to need to deputize some others. And you know what? Eventually they'll get to like Jamaicans and to other Black immigrants where they'll, you know, do the Candace Owens thing. You know, like you Nigerians are so much better than Black-born Americans. I mean, you guys are, oh my God. You're not really in statistics, but somehow we've created this narrative that you are, because we just need to create in every people a population of anti-Black bigots. That's the actual strategy. The long-term strategy is have a permanent Black underclass that will permanently be exploited for their labor, and we will find the bigot in every group that will help us keep anti-Blackness alive for life. And if our schools are doing anything to help push that forward and make that happen, I would think that's an educator's challenge. That's like all of our challenge, is to say, no, we're going to be explicit about reversing and teaching this, because we're not going to prepare kids to be petty bigots in different groups that continue anti-Blackness for the exploitation of the Black underclass, like, right? But all that I just said, think about how alluring it is. Now, see, you guys, if you would know this if you watch this and Sharif was here, I always revert back to my movie, The Matrix. So in The Matrix, there's this portion where the guy gets pulled out of the Matrix and he wants to go back in. He's like, listen, I just want to go back into the Matrix and know what a steak
I want that steak dinner.
I want that steak dinner,
baby.
I just want to go back in. Listen, this reality world,
I choose
this has been
Matrix.
cute and all that, you know, but put me back in the Matrix. That's the sense that I think a lot of people have. Is like, listen, I came out here and messed with y'all for a while and did this, you know, this solidarity, peace and justice, social justice stuff for a while. It does not pay well. The steak does not taste as good. Put me back in the damn Matrix. And you know what? People are signing up for the Matrix. Anyways, I want to come back to this.
The Matrix.
That's quiet quitting. That's what it is, man. They're quiet quitting. Put me back in the Matrix.
That's social justice, quiet quitting. Is like
exactly
the social justice form. Yeah, I was for it for a while, but you know,
too hard. It's hard.
The schools are bad. The neighborhoods are terrible. The only thing
food's good.
The food's good. You know, and you know, you can have a good time, but you know, when it comes time to raise your own kids, let's make sure that we get that suburban palace. Omar, someone's challenged you, bro. So Michael Brass in the comments,
I saw that. I was going to address that. Yeah,
he says your description of Shays Rebellion was highly inaccurate to fit your narrative, the speaker's narrative. So Michael Brass, I don't know who you are, but you chose violence in the morning. So Omar is your is
your target. Yeah. And I mean, my one question to that is like, what's your source? Like, where are you coming from in terms of your perspective of Shays Rebellion? Because if you just decided to like look it up on Wikipedia, like, cool, like I venture to say, whip open Howardson's People's History of the United States and take a very accurate look at what that rebellion was about. And essentially the overall idea of Shays Rebellion was that the white aristocracy, this is your George Washington's, James Madison's, your revolutionary leaders who essentially, you know, paid poor farmers to take their place in the Revolutionary War. They're the ones who broke up this rebellion in order to ensure that, hey, don't look at us. Don't look at the white aristocracy. Don't look at the white dominant class. We're not your problem. And it was a very marked example of one of the times where they explicitly ensured that you low-income people should be fighting one another because race is a difference. So instead of joining together racially for socioeconomic benefit, you should realize that if you don't acquiesce to the aristocracy, we're going to make your world a living pain in the butt. So join us, because then at least your situation won't be as bad as the blacks. And I venture to say, if you can, Michael Brass, come up with better firsthand sources than Howard Zinn and all those firsthand sources that I then read out of the footnotes, then cool, like, man, bring it. But if I'm going to bring up something historical, there's nothing inaccurate about it. Period. So come at me, bro. And for all our listeners, this is what I'm talking about with critical thinking. If you're going to come to the table and say something about colonial revolutionary America or history or politics, especially when it comes to like this audience, yo, you better come correct, because like, sorry, man, like we got a wealth of knowledge about this. And I think this addresses really quickly one of the comments that I saw earlier about like, what's the point of having this affiliation with black and brown? That is the point. The point is that, look, how many blacks and Mexicans are in the upper class of America? Are there as many as the white folks? Most of us are pretty much middle and working class folks. And I got to tell you, the solidarity factor to me isn't just one because I think that it's morally right, isn't just one because, I don't know, it just makes sense. Why are we fighting one another? That just seems silly. It starts making a lot more sense when you think about a combined group of people working for greater economic prosperity. Because if we're fighting one another, we're just crippling each other. Instead of uniting one another, because our shared economic situation is quite similar. And if we really realized that our combined power would actually allow for things that I think are incredibly important, that I was talking about in 8 Black Hands, like more bank loans. That's such a simple component. Like, start doing the studies. Blacks and Mexicans are turned down for bank loans at this like insanely alarming rate. And when you don't get bank loans, you don't get mortgages. You don't get mortgages, you don't own property. You don't get bank loans, you can't open up businesses. You can't open up businesses, you don't create inherited wealth. And the economic prosperity of blacks and Latinos are so inextricably tied together that if we just combined our forces, holy smokes, we would have greater economic prosperity, and you would start seeing essentially the like working class rise up into a middle class, folks that are, you know, food what's the right word, David? Food scarcity, food
living in food deserts,
food insecurity.
Yeah,
food insecurity, and having basically to scrape by, start rising up that Maslow's hierarchy of needs and essentially saying, hey, listen, like, we're not having just struggle to survive anymore. We're in a good place. And when you're in a good place, that means, hey, we can spend more time with our kids. We can focus more on kids' education. When I've got our parents working 3 jobs, barely scraping by, how much time do they have to spend with their children in the educational world? And that has a massive impact on a child's education. So when you talk to me about like what's in it for us, I don't know, like not struggling economically anymore, it sounds pretty good to me. What do you gents think?
Yeah, you know, listen, I think that that's right. And I think from a soul perspective, we're aligned. We're of one. We're like of one people. I was raised that way, though. I was trained to be that way when Black and Chicano relationships were a given. It was just there was no expectation in my childhood growing up the way my family was structured and my communities were structured to think any other way, right? I realized, though, that I'm 54 years old and the world has changed greatly. And the incentives have changed. And I think what I've learned about capitalism in the United States, whatever you incentivize, you get more of, right? The incentives right now are to go dominate culture in anything. Like if I was new to this country and I really wanted to be more American than thou and succeed in this country, I would become a Trumper quickly, right? Because it would give me instant free pass from everything. Like I could be Herschel Walker and have multiple babies and multiple baby mamas, and it wouldn't matter because I'm a Trumper, right?
Mhm.
Like the fastest way
Yeah.
is to join the dominant team. You get here for 5 minutes. You come to this country in 5 minutes. I've seen it happen with Asians. I've seen it happen with Candace Owens types. You know, to be here, her family's here one generation, and now they've got a Trumper daughter who's a millionaire, right? Without a college education, right? College, straight up college dropout. What Black person in the United States can go straight to millionaire status as a college dropout statistically? What's the fastest? What's, you know, like at Disneyland, we talked about that before this show. Disneyland, there's that fast pass. What's the fast pass to white acceptance, right? It's to denounce Black
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And that incentive is there for Blacks, new immigrants, Asians,
Mhm.
Latinos, everybody.
Yes.
The thing you
And-
said, Omar, is my childhood understanding of the world is we all do better when we do better, right? Like my childhood understanding is, listen, we're all in the same boat. We better sail the same damn direction, right? We're all economically being, well, that changed after a while when they started picking off parts of our population and giving them a few things, few corporate jobs, few executive jobs. You mentioned Stanford earlier, Stanford kicking out some affirmative action kind of Negroes back in the 60s and 70s and whatnot. And suddenly we've created a class of Ward Connerlys and Clarence Thomases and now Candace Owens and Christian Walkers and whatnot. The incentives are great. Christian Walker is like wearing $1,000 hoodie talking about Biden on TikTok and making a full ass living doing it, right? Like anti-Blackness is a big business. The incentives are just different. I don't know if that,
That's really
and I
well
know we're
said.
coming to the end here. I mean,
It's really well said.
You know,
Also, $1,000 hoodie. What the hell you need a $1,000 hoodie for?
Exactly. I do need one. I don't know why, but I mean, it just feels like
Just to have one be like, yeah, I came up in the world. This hoodie's $1,000, baby.
But you're not going to sell your people out for one.
I'm not going to sell my people out for one. And this is
Well
why this
said.
discussion was so great for me, in that I feel like there's a level of maturity in us that we have to pass some of it on, or else we're going to be part of the problem of watching our youth wash away. Like they wash away and drift spiritually, politically, socially, as corporate America through music and art and bad algorithms feeds them a steady diet of ignorance and division and, you know, whatever. Our schools are our one chance. So, you know, for those of you that are educators that still control a school, you control minds. So hope I hope that there's still hope for Black-brown bridges to be built. I know that there is, you know, in my age group, because I'm Gen X, we're the greatest generation ever. Thank you for everybody listening. We hold the whole world together, just so you know. Don't get it twisted. Anyways, fellas, what would you say as a last word to somebody who's been listening to this today about the need for history, Black and brown history, a theology maybe, or whatever, a politic of Black and brown solidarity?
I'd say, you know, I was a history major, a poli-sci major in my undergrad, and I studied Chicano history, political science. So it's always been part of my world. But I think in terms of closing thoughts, nothing specific. I would just offer that you know, we need to rethink and refocus on the importance of teaching history in our schools, teaching civics. Right, we've lost that over the last like 10 years, 15 years. So I think of K-12. I think it's critically important that we get back on track, students are learning, you know, both high quality content, high quality teaching methods around history that they can see themselves in. Really what we're talking about on this show, and Chris just alluded to it, we're talking about teaching. We're talking about teachers and what they do every day with students in their classes. And so I think a full-on refocusing of history in our K-12 schools. And then the other thing, which is free, and is you know, looking within your own families and you know, making sure that we are bringing out the stories as we're sharing stories here on this platform, making sure that, you know, our young people and not so young people are turning to their own families and pulling out stories that exist that you might not even know about within your own families. So thinking about the formal education setting of the home, your home culture, of your community. There's a tremendous amount of wealth of information and experience that that we should be tapping into. And the last thing is, don't sell your people out, and don't sell your soul to the devil.
That's a good one. That's the hardest one, but I mean, $1,000 hoodie ain't worth it. Don't do it. So, Omar, what's your final word, sir?
Yeah, I think that the historical component and the literacy component that we talked about on the show is something that I'm like a little bit alarmed at now later in life. So where was my exposure in schools to literature that was written by Black Americans, by Latino, Latinas, by Asians, something that got me thinking about something else besides like the dominant culture? It was almost non-existent, right? And we are doing our best to start integrating these books, and we start seeing pushback. And that pushback means to me we're doing the right thing. Because like David even alluded to it, like we start pushing like Chicano studies or ethnic studies, and they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm like, dude, that is a evident sign that clearly they don't want this integration. And like, listen, Chris, I mean this seriously, because coming from the state of Texas, Chris, they wanted to eliminate Thomas Jefferson from the history books purely for the fact that he talked about separation between church and state. They wanted to eliminate, oh, I'm sorry, have eliminated. My bad. Have eliminated. They eliminated Thurgood Marshall from our history books to replace that with Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America. I don't understand how anyone can think to themselves that it's okay to completely whitewash our literacy and our history and think that this is going to have a benefit for everybody. This is the attempt to say, hey, the differences between you all are going to allow you all to understand how much you hate each other so you can fight it out. And while you're fighting, you're not paying attention to the massive injustices that we're doing in order to ensure that the dominant culture and the aristocracy in this country perpetuate. And it's time for us to wake up, because the reality is, if we were able to do simple things like, again, provide books that provide greater ethnic background, how about just a general understanding that America was built by Black people? Like just that general understanding, like, oh, all those monuments that you go visit in Washington, D.C., who do you think built them? Who do you think fed them? Who do you think built the infrastructure of this country? And simple components to understand that when we say this is America, America was built upon the combined efforts of immigrants. And sadly, so much of the infrastructure was built by Black slaves. And that is such an important facet to understand, because until we start understanding our commonalities, we will continue to fight over our differences. And if we continue to fight over our differences, then the progression of us as a country and as a people is going to be stymied, because it is always in the interest of the dominant culture to keep us fighting one another so that we don't see what they're up to. And I got to tell you, like, that's not the America that I want to live in. And as you alluded, Chris, we got to start making changes to this Constitution in this country, because we're at the brink of what is looking like, you know, people talk about a civil war. And I'm like, oh my God, like, this is dangerous. So yes, now is a time for greater unity amongst us all, because the more we fight, the more we're going to lose.
I think that's a great place to stop. It is the most important, I think, kind of point, which is there's a bigger reason for us to actually show solidarity with each other. The small time short benefit of actually atomizing and joining the dominant culture are actually completely insufficient to address the fact that we're about to completely enslave all ourselves into the future. This kind of takeover, moral, hostile takeover of the country by a small group of people is very reminiscent of South Africa. And if you think that just because there's a browning of America, that it's going to be numerically impossible to still kind of dominate the same populations that have been dominated. You don't know your history. There are small groups. There are places where small groups of colonists have been able to keep entire countries and entire nations subjugated. So don't sign up for your own subjugation because they're throwing you a few diamonds here and there and you think that you're going to be a star. It ain't gonna happen. Black and brown solidarity for everybody. Listen, people, we need solidarity all around: economic, racial, spiritual solidarity in so many different ways. And we need to stop atomizing. We're gonna become slaves if we keep doing that. This has been another Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer after an hour with my guest and me. My guest today have been David Castillo, and you can find him on Twitter. His Twitter handle is at Castillo David CA for California, I assume, and Omar underscore Yanar, YANAR, was our other guest today, and you can find them both on Twitter. Please follow them, retweet them, make your family and your timeline smarter by doing so. You can follow me too. You know, my takes are really hot and amazing, and they're awesome all the time. So like you should do that too. And we love y'all for spending our Friday mornings just learning, having a learning lab and learning together. Communal learning opportunities will save America. Thank you all for watching.